Hey, how you doing?
I'm okay. How you doing?
All is well, all is well. First and foremost, thank you so much for stopping by on the platform. I really appreciate you taking out the time to talk to us about some of the amazing work that you've been doing.
Delighted to do it.
All right, all right. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know what your name is and definitely where you're from?
Yeah, sure. Stuart Hart, uh, currently an emeritus professor, but I've been, sort of a how shall we say, a uh, serial professor, entrepreneur at Michigan, at UNC Chapel Hill, at Cornell, and most recently the University of Vermont. And my focus since the late '80s has been on. I'm a strategy professor, and the connection is between my interest is how do we connect business strategy and purpose to actually making positive contributions in the world, and still be competitive and make money doing it.
Wow, okay, okay. That's amazing. Um, Now can I ask you, are you teaching any courses right now? What courses are they?
Yeah, yeah. Well, as I say, I'm an emeritus, which is fancy talk in academia for retired. But what that means is that I can pretty much pick and choose the gigs I want to do. So I'm still involved at Vermont, and sort of an advisor there around practicum. And I'm back. I'm in Ann Arbor, and I'm back connected again at Michigan, which is where I started. I was the founder of the dual degree program at Michigan between Ross School, the business school, and now the School of Environment and Sustainability. It's called the Herb Institute Dual Masters Program. So I'm reconnected there. It's sort of like going home again, because I started in the '80s in the business school at Michigan. So I am teaching a course in the fall called Strategies for Sustainable Development, which focuses on sort of market transformation. What do we need to do in order to remake capitalism so it works for everybody?
Okay, okay. Wow, that's amazing work as well. Now I was going to ask you about this. I was looking on your website, I believe, Enterprise for a Sustainable World. You know, you make mention of this kind of often. When did you develop this passion for environment and business?
Yeah, I mean that could take a few minutes to explain, which I'm happy to do. Uh, so because I'm an old guy, I have a long history, and it sort of goes back to, believe it or not, the late '60s, early '70s, which was sort of the inception of, at least in the U.S., the modern environmental movement. And so I got sort of caught up in that. I was in college at the time, had a couple of inspirational professors that really inspired me around that. So upon graduating from college, I did a master's degree at Yale, what was then called the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. It's now called the School for the Environment. Um, and at the time, this is now mid '70s, sort of was pretty convinced that corporations were the enemy, and they probably were. And that was still a time when people thought government could play a positive role in the world. And so a lot of the work I did was around, what was then kind of the emerging environmental regulations and laws, like the National Environmental Policy Act that requires environmental impact statements, or what was then in the late '70s, kind of the Carter administration era program in decentralized solar technology. There was a big push during the Carter administration with regard to decentralized solar, and that all came to a screeching halt in 1980 when Reagan was elected. But a lot of my work then, so I was in the NGO world, was around how do we sort of bring sort of more responsibility to big decisions by corporations and government agencies. But I became increasingly disenchanted with that work because it became evident pretty quickly that most of the work around, like, writing environmental impact statements really turned out to just be sort of a stopgap measure to stop projects and delay projects. It turned into be like a legal gambit. And that's kind of the way it still is, kind of developers write these statements and then they get sued and then it's hung up in court. And it just slows things down, and it's actually become a problem, right? And like Ezra Klein's new book goes into that. Ezra Klein has a new book titled, which is Abundance, where a lot of the well-intended environmental laws from the '70s now have just become major kind of sources of delay, which means you never deliver anything. That's been a big problem with the Democrats in particular. Anyway, I became increasingly disenchanted with that, and got more and more interested in trying to understand why would such seemingly destructive decisions be made in the first place. And I was working with a guy who had a PhD, and did his dissertation on forest products companies, and so this sort of warmed me up to the idea that, well, maybe I could understand kind of how this actually works. I got interested in strategy and strategic decision making. So I ended up going back and I did my PhD at Michigan in strategy and policy. And this is now the kind of early to mid 80s. By that time, business schools were hiring PhD trained faculty in large numbers because they had been criticized, during the 70s, especially for being, sort of non-academic, kind of bastions of retired accountants and consultants and business people that taught all the courses, but no PhD trained or a few PhD trained faculty that were doing research. So there was a big hiring binge of PhD faculty in the mid 80s. I was among those that got hired. I had a bunch of job offers, had one from Michigan, so I decided to stay and join the faculty at the business school in Michigan in 1985, teaching strategy. And after a few sort of immediately thrown into the core course in strategy for the MBAs, and kind of bombed that the first time, but then with the help of a couple of well-established professors, not the least of which was a guy named C.K. Prahalad, who may be a familiar name to some people. If you're familiar with terms like core competency and that sort of thing, those are Prahaladisms. Anyway, he's the guy that taught me how to teach. I got decent at teaching the core course in strategy, but by the late 80s, I didn't really believe in what I was teaching. Most of the strategy kind of core course content was around how to build, how to build, kind of protective moats around your company to establish competitive advantage, how to screw suppliers, and aggregate all the value to your company. And I just didn't believe in what I was teaching, right? That was not my background. And I had an identity crisis there for a period of time where I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in a business school. And around 1990, I realize this is an ancient history lesson, but about that, it was in 1990, there was a new dean that came to the business school and to what was then the School of Natural Resources and Environment at Michigan. They were the first boomer deans. It was like a generational shift. They were only like 7 or 8 years older than me. And they hit it off. And this opened the door to create, this dual degree program across the two schools. And I jumped through that window and never looked back. So I became the founding director of what was then called the Corporate Environmental Management Program, which, blended brought in 3 years, you earn an MBA from the business school and a master's degree from the School of Natural Resources and Environment. And, we created our own little sort of kind of curriculum for those dual degree students as well. I stayed after that and then kept writing, sort of wrote stuff that kind of established me in this domain 30 years ago because I've been working at it that long. And then other schools started coming after me. And so I had tenured offers. I went to UNC and founded a Center for Sustainable Enterprise there. Then I was recruited to Cornell and was the founding director of a center there called the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise. And, all along sort of my work evolved, gradually realized that this stuff, 30 years ago, people talked about greening was great, but it, was not nearly significant enough. It was just about incrementally reducing negative impact, kind of reducing waste and reducing emissions and so forth, eco-efficiency, all great, but it didn't take long to realize that wasn't going to get us there. So most of my work for the last 30 years is focused on sort of sustainable innovation, that it would take much more transformative change, both environmentally in terms of leapfrog technology, not just incremental reduction in negative impact, but getting to truly sustainable and regenerative technologies on a commercial basis. But then also increasingly have done work for the last 20, 30 years focused around social equity, that the current form of capitalism as practiced, especially the American version of the last 30 years, has created a huge gulf, of income inequality, and social justice issues as well, and racial justice issues. So I've done a bunch of work over the last 20, 25 years focused on how can we craft strategies that serve and lift the underserved at the base of the income pyramid, both internationally in the developing world and now increasingly here in the US as well. And so think of that as sort of inclusive strategies, right? That that makes sense in terms of business growth and business success, but also serve and lift the underserved at the same time. And then, since going emeritus at Cornell, uh, got involved at the University of Vermont in starting this completely, as the founding director of this completely new MBA program called the Sustainable Innovation MBA, because it became, again, increasingly clear that MBA education, as it's been committed since the 80s, is sort of a market fundamentalist, shareholder primacy driven. In other words, that the purpose of business is to maximize profit for the shareholders. And that just doesn't work. That makes a few people rich, but it doesn't work for the majority of people, and it sure doesn't work for the environment. And so it became increasingly clear that we needed larger systemic change, beginning with business education itself. So the Sustainable Innovation MBA at the University of Vermont, at now the Grossman School of Business, is a clean sheet redesign of what business education should look like for the 21st century. So we started over again, went back to basics and built a completely new MBA program from scratch that rejected market fundamentalism and shareholder primacy, and teaches the knowledge, skills, capability toolkit for, kind of corporate transformation, people interested in corporate transformation, but also entrepreneurs. But it has to do with creating the sustainable and inclusive enterprises of the future. That's the whole purpose and focus of the MBA program at Vermont from the beginning. And I stepped back from that just before COVID hit. And so I'm still an advisor there, and then became, sort of consumed with writing this new book that came out just last year, the title of which is Beyond Shareholder Primacy, Remaking Capitalism for a Sustainable Future. That's sort of my life's arc, and that's where I am now, still working with companies on a few corporate sustainability advisory councils, was on the net impact board for a number of years, and again, just doing selected things with universities.
Wow. Okay, that's amazing. I really appreciate you taking out the time to break that down. Like you say, you've been doing it more than 30 years, and that's probably longer than some of your students have been alive. So
That's true.
you're
That's
doing some
true.
major work. That's amazing. Now I can ask you, going through all of the years, do you think are more people, I guess maybe conscious or even interested in obtaining a sustainable future, or is it about the same or less people?
No, I'd say, if I think back on when we were first sort of starting this dual degree, in the early to mid 90s, uh, it was much more controversial, that there were a few students interested, and, that was enough to make up a cohort. But I would say the resistance came more at the faculty level and at the societal level, right? I mean, that, you would be seen, in the business school as, some tree hugging communist, and in the environment school, some kind of rapacious capitalist pig, the same person trying to make these things happen. I think that's changed. That there's probably not much in the way of faculty resistance either place. That, I mean, there's still some there. That the current administration likes to paint universities as though they're these uniformly left wing, kind of, and it's just simply not the case, right? There are faculty that have a range of views. In the business school especially, there are still those that are, adherents to the Chicago School of Economics and Milton Friedman and so forth, all the way to the other extreme, both in the business school and especially over in the School for the Environment. So there's a wide range of views still, but I would say that today, in the year 2025, most faculty understand that we're facing an existential sort of set of crises, whether it has to do with climate change or loss of biodiversity or toxic inequality, right? That I think most faculty get that, understand that that's the case, but that might have very different views as to what we do about it.
Okay, okay. Now I can ask you this. Now, what about the changes with technology? You got AI, you got social media, different things like that. Has that been a easy or difficult transition, and has it helped, or is it worse, or?
Right. Well, so I think the argument, like going back, I wrote a piece now in 1997 that was in Harvard Business Review. The title was Beyond Greening Strategies for a Sustainable World. And it made the case that we had to move beyond incrementalism, that we had to get beyond just this, well, with our current manufacturing processes, we can reduce emissions, and save money. That was kind of the greening agenda. Still is, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't get us anywhere near where we need to be. So the beyond greening argument was that it has to be about innovation, right? We have to leapfrog over currently, inherently unsustainable technologies. We have to leapfrog past them and, kind of creatively destroy industries as they currently exist in favor of getting to what comes next that might have a chance of being long-term sustainable and regenerative. That was a more fanciful argument 30 years ago. I think it's very real today, right? I think that's the difference is, you see a whole suite of technologies that have emerged, really across we see the revolution in clean energy, in electric vehicles, in a range of other technologies, in sustainable agriculture, right? And sustainable nutrition and affordable nutrition. And I put AI among those technologies that have great potential to solve problems in dramatic ways. But of course, AI also has the potential to do incredible harm. And we're living that experience as we speak. We'll see kind of which pathway we choose. Whether AI can be harnessed, whether it can be controlled, whether it can be focused on actually helping us solve the world's problems, or whether it ends up running amok.
Yeah, it gets scary sometimes. Let me see. Okay, now I wanted to ask you. You sent me the concept paper, bringing the world inside. If you
Yeah,
could talk about that a little bit.
yeah, absolutely. So a lot of my work, and I'd say people like me, others that have tried to be sort of, uh, how should we say, kind of uh, advocates in some way, but it's research based as well for this kind of new kind of business, sustainable business, we'll call it, sustainable and inclusive business. Most of us have focused, either myself included, on large, publicly held corporations, or else the other end of the spectrum, kind of tiny B Corps, benefit corporations, uh, B certified corporations, or impact investing, which is looking to kind of invest in entrepreneurs that are trying to stand up new companies that serve the underserved, or that leapfrog, into these sort of clean and regenerative technologies. Both of those are great, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with either of those. I've spent pretty much my life doing that, but it became increasingly clear that given the systemic constraints of shareholder capitalism, of the current form of capitalism, that as it's practiced in the US, that sort of started here in the 80s and spread to the rest of the world, this sort of shareholder first form of capitalism, that, in large publicly held corporations, it's exceedingly difficult for the leadership of those companies to take the more transformative path, because they get disciplined back into place, by analysts and by Wall Street and by activist investors. And the same thing's true at the other end of the spectrum. Maybe impact investors or startup companies can secure some early financing, but should they reach the point where they look like they can be successful and they would typically go public, most of these companies don't want to go public, because if they end up on the stock market, then they got Wall Street down their throat, demanding quarterly earnings growth and so forth. And so it became increasingly clear that if we're going to really sort of create the transformation there needs to be a different leverage point, because these companies are sort of stuck, right? A colleague of mine here at Michigan, a professor named Jerry Davis, has written a piece called uh, "Shareholder Capitalism as a Suicide Pact." And in some ways, I think it's accurate. That the truth is that since the 80s, because over the course of the 80s, most defined pension, companies that offered defined pensions, like the auto industry and so forth, that all went away, right, in favor of just defined contributions, right? And you privatized it into 401ks and that sort of thing, right? That most companies don't have pensions anymore; they have 401k plans. So the result is that half of Americans own stock. You know, there's a half that don't, right? But half of Americans own stock, and a lot of people that used to work in companies, in manufacturing companies, their pension is in the stock market, right? They have IRAs and 401ks. So they have a vested interest too in seeing the stock market do well, right? Because that's their retirement. The problem is that most of the publicly held companies, in other words, the companies that make up the stock market, are being driven, right? Their value is defined, their stock price is defined by how rapidly they grow earnings and how profitable they are. And that can often come at the expense of the kind of sustainable innovations we're talking about, or making the leap. Right now, there are a few, you had Elon Musk and Tesla stock go wild, but that's more the exception, kind of betting on the come than it is the rule. Most innovative, sustainable companies focused on innovation, they tend to get slammed by the stock market, right? Because they don't demonstrate the short-term performance that the market demands. So the result is you have, that's the suicide pact part. People need the market. They need the market to go up. But if the market goes up, it means we have more companies that are doing damage to the world and perpetuating inequality. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. So this initiative that we've started, and it's a guy named Fred Keller and I. Fred was a business founder here in Michigan, in Western Michigan, a company called Cascade Engineering, and it's privately held, and that's the key, right, to our initiative. And Fred has been able to run his company since its inception the way, according to his values. He doesn't have to answer to Wall Street. He runs the company the way that he sees fit, and the other kind of leaders of the company see fit. And that's for him always meant a focus on social equity and the environment, right? And he's done that for 40 years, and the company's been very successful. His daughter, who I had as an MBA student at Cornell, is now the CEO. But the company continues on being run in that spirit and has been successful, in fact, in changing the rules of the game in the state of Michigan on a number of fronts, but especially with kind of programs that they've pioneered and things like welfare to work, hiring the formerly incarcerated, and demonstrating that can work in a really, not only a really beneficial way for the formerly incarcerated themselves, but for the company as well, and for the community. And that's spread now. That got taken out as an NGO called The Source, where there's actually kind of a documented approach to doing this and how it works. And a number of companies have taken that up in Western Michigan in the Grand Rapids area. And there's now an accumulated set of data to show that this is a really effective thing to do. And those people have been successful in going to Lansing, which is the state capital in Michigan, and convincing the legislators there to change the laws about what's required when it comes to hiring the formerly incarcerated, making it easier for companies to hire the formerly incarcerated. And so Fred and business people like him have always had this kind of focus. And so that's led us to launch this new initiative where, we say there's real leverage if we can look at the middle of the economy, right? That the vast majority of companies in the US or anywhere else in the world aren't the large public corporations, or the small startups or the B Corps. It's the mid-tier companies, most of which are privately held. In fact, a factoid is in the US, 90% of the companies that earn $100 million in revenue more each year are privately held, and they create 80% of all the new jobs. It's not the big public companies that create the jobs. They mostly eliminate jobs. And the tiny companies don't hire that many people. It's the mid-tier companies of the economy that do the bulk of the new hiring and create the bulk of the new jobs, and the vast majority of them are privately held. So our initiative, which we're calling internality, which is a play on the term externality, because we believe we need to eliminate externalities, that if we can build a community of business leaders in the mid-tier, privately held, often family-run companies who are knowledgeable, that their companies aren't tiny. They might make 100 million, 200 million, 500 million, $1 billion a year in revenue. Those aren't small companies, but they're not large global companies earning 200 billion, right? And on the public market, or they're not tiny startups earning, 5 million. They're substantial companies, they're established companies, but they're mid-tier and they're private and often family run. If we can build a community of those like-minded business leaders, because they've pretty much been ignored, right? And they don't really have a place to go. The big corporations have have groups like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the tiny companies have like B Lab and and the B Corp world and so forth. But the mid-tier companies really don't. They don't really have. There's no place that looks to build community around them. So our intention is to how do we find their theory is that there are many hundreds, maybe thousands of Fred Kellers in the country and in the world, and they don't know each other, and they need to know each other. And if we can build a common voice and bring them together, build community around them, and then look to co-create innovations. Each of those business leaders has done a number of things in their own companies, but together, if we can combine forces, if we can kind of riff off each other and generate innovations, that's how we're going to get to the larger transformational changes that we need. And if we can build enough momentum of hundreds or thousands of these kind of business leaders, they don't have a bunch of lobbyists in Washington like ExxonMobil does, but if we can build a collective voice, they can have influence too, because it's going to take a systemic change of the rules and regulations by which capitalism is conducted. And if we can bring that unified voice, or a unified form of that voice, that might be just what we need in terms of transformational change.
Wow. Okay. Now I wanted to ask you one more point about genetically modified business. If you could speak about that a little bit.
Yeah. The title of that little concept paper is CRISPR for Capitalism. So, which is it's a metaphor, tended to be somewhat provocative. But the idea really is that, capitalism as it's currently being conducted, as I've said now a number of times, is, it's run with a certain operating system. There's a certain DNA right underneath it, and a set of assumptions, right, and a worldview that goes with it, which is mostly things like, well, the goal of the economy, the purpose of the economy, the purpose of capitalism is to maximize individual freedom, right, and that and economic and individual freedom is maximized by having economic freedom to express yourself through your purchase decisions. And that's the best way to organize society, right? Because there's no coercion involved. We're not passing laws that force people to do things they don't want to do. They can express their preferences, in the marketplace by their purchase decisions. This was Milton Friedman's theory, right? That capitalism and freedom, right? That capitalism is the way for us to maximize a free society. Now, there are all kinds of holes in that argument, right? But that's really sort of the underlying assumption that if we just enable unfettered free markets, that markets themselves will arrive at the best societal outcomes. That's the theory of free market capitalism. And it just simply hasn't worked, right? I mean, there are all kinds of holes in that theory, most of which have been, the assumptions have been debunked, that people are not rational actors. There's a whole field called behavioral economics that shows that people don't often make rational choices, with full information. In order for free market capitalism to work, all of the market players have to have full information and be rational actors. Now that's a big assumption. Doesn't work that way. That business people should also play according to the rules, and at least the way Adam Smith framed it was, business people and market actors should behave with virtue in the classical sense, which meant they should be concerned for the well-being of others in their economic transactions. That's not the way that market fundamentalist capitalism has come to be. It's much more about selfishness than it is self-interest for the common good. So a lot of the assumptions, around the sort of 80s version of capitalism that we currently live under, have been pretty much, debunked, but yet we still kind of behave as though they're true. And the result is, the outcomes are, a climate crisis, a sixth extinction, and toxic inequality that, that verges on, we could have serious societal unrest, with the kind of inequality that exists. So it's time for us to sort of rethink that operating system. It's time for us to rethink the DNA that underpins it. And, so the idea behind the paper is that there's still a lot of good DNA strands associated with capitalism, like the idea that, the idea of, at least at some level, private property, the rule of law, individual incentives, respect for contracts, those things can actually be harnessed in a really positive way. But some of the other things that I've just been describing, not so much. So maybe we've arrived at a time where we need to genetically modify capitalism, that we can get in there just like CRISPR and edit out the really bad genes, the cancer genes, and leave the good ones, and maybe edit in some new ones, right, along the lines that I've just been describing, so that we can transform capitalism into a form, what I call sustainable capitalism, that actually works for everyone and is also geared around, the long-term well-being of the planet itself, that underpins everything we do economically.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. We're about 30 minutes in. I wanted to ask you one last question, if it's okay.
Sure.
Okay. For the viewers who want to keep up with what you're doing and want to check out the book, um, Beyond Shareholder Primacy, where can they get it? And if you could give a little bit about what's the book about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. First of all, it's published by Stanford Business Books, which is part of Stanford University Press. So it's available there. You can also just get it on Amazon. Real easy. It's in Kindle form too. So that one's easy. You can just, you can Google it or just go right to Amazon and pick it up. The book itself, as I described a little bit earlier, sort of the motivation for writing it came out of my realization probably 10 years ago that we weren't just going to get there with the, kind of innovation within individual companies, that it was going to take more systemic change, as I've just been describing. And so the title kind of belies that, right? Beyond Shareholder Primacy, Remaking Capitalism for a Sustainable Future. So the first part of the book, the first third of the book, is historical. I was sort of driven to understand, how is it we could have possibly gotten to where we are now? Like, has it always been this way? And the short answer is no. I mean, this version of capitalism that we've been living with since the 80s is an aberration in many ways, right? I think a lot of people, especially business students and in many cases business people, think that what we're living right now, that this form of capitalism is capitalism, that has always been this way, and this is the way it was meant to be, which is just simply not true, right? The last 40 years have been an aberration. Capitalism, especially American style capitalism before the 80s and 70s, going back to the post-war years, was very different. It was run with a different operating system than it has been since the 80s, right? That we came out of the Second World War, as the US as the dominant player in the world, and didn't have a lot of competition at the time, granted, but it meant that we were able to run kind of business in a way. In fact, the leaders of companies like GM and IBM called it welfare capitalism, right? That they ran their companies to create promotion ladders to build the middle class. That was when we built the middle class, right? It was in the post-war years, and the genesis of that was the Great Depression, right? That the Great Depression in the 30s sort of threw out the old kind of monopoly capitalism of the Gilded Age, right? That was the rise of FDR and the New Deal and the reassertion of the role of government and not just laissez-faire. We've kind of had these big swings over time, because the Gilded Age has a lot of resemblance to our day, to what's going on today, right? There was a similar philosophy of laissez-faire that we should shrink government and it should be a free market, and we saw what happened there, right? Yes, we built some incredible industries, we built some wealth for a few, but we also created huge inequality and environmental degradation on a scale that's pretty significant, and then a market meltdown, and in the 29 meltdown in the Great Depression. So and then you go back further than that, and the sort of the original DNA for capitalism was the mercantilist age. The British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company had similar motivation, which was just simply to extract wherever they could to maximize the returns to the shareholders. The British East India Company was the first joint stock limited liability corporation in the world, exactly the same structure as GM today. Funded with private equity. Back then, the investors were called adventure capitalists, right? It was the age of discovery, as they called it, or adventure capitalists. But it was really about mercantilism, which was going and extracting resources from other parts of the world wherever they could find it, subjugating native peoples, enslaving people, and running economies based on that. That was mercantilist capitalism. that was sort of the founding DNA of capitalism itself, and we've been trying to deal with it ever since, right? So we've gone through these wild swings where there's reformation for a period of time, only to have it come back again, like the Gilded Age, but then the New Deal and welfare capitalism reforms for a period of time, only to have it swing back again in the 70s and 80s to this sort of shareholder primacy. So the first part of the book, I think, is hopeful because it shows that it doesn't need to be this way. It hasn't always been this way, which means that it's within our power to change it again. And it's probably even more important for us to think transformatively now than in the past, because the scale and scope of the challenges now are at a level we've never seen before in the world, where it's existential. But it's within our power to change it because it's happened before. That's the first part of the book. Second part of the book then, is about corporate transformation. So I'm a strategy guy. So this is sort of the strategy part of the book, where I talk about what is it that business leaders can do, right, around bringing purpose to life. How do you embed purpose within the firm, and how do you begin to think more than just about your company or even your value chain, but as a business leader to take a role in creating change out in the wider system, in the institutional environment that holds you back, which is part of what internality is all about. So I call that having a corporate quest, and that increasingly business leaders have to take that on. They have to become agents of system change, not just managing the strategy of their own company or even their own value chain. And then the third part of the book is on institutional innovation, institutional reform, institutional redesign, because we need to kind of shift the institutions of capitalism itself if we're going to have a new form of sustainable capitalism. And so the two leverage points I focus on there in terms of institutional change, the first is Wall Street itself, right? That public equity markets have just become so trained on short-termism, but it hasn't always been that way. Again, there's nothing sacred or preordained about quarterly earnings growth and short-term profitability as a driver of stock price. We've just decided that that's the narrative because that's what business schools have taught since the 80s. And that's so it's almost like a mindset, right? It's a narrative, it's a story. There's nothing sacred about it. It's not preordained. It's nowhere is it written in stone tablets that that's what it has to be. And especially with public equity markets, because public equity markets are entirely secondary, right? There's some new investment in like the New York Stock Exchange where there's new stock issues and that sort of thing, where there's real money being invested in companies when they go public. But here's some factoid for you. For the New York Stock Exchange, the dollar value of new issues every year, like initial public offerings and SPACs, is about 300 billion. But share buybacks by existing corporations, which is a tool used by existing public corporations to drive up the stock price in the short term, right? Because if you buy back your own stock, there's fewer shares, so the value of each share goes up, right? That's a way to drive up the stock price in the short term. It's been used, as a tool since the SEC said it was okay again in the 80s. Well, the value of share buybacks by existing companies is about $1 trillion a year. So share buybacks swamp new issues 3-1, which means public equity markets in the US actually extract capital. They don't contribute it, right? They're actually retiring capital, right? Buying back the shares more than new investment. And so if that's the case, they're purely trading markets, right? That it's just about buying and selling existing shares and derivatives. Well, if that's the case, if it's a secondary market, then we could decide it should be anything that should drive the stock price. There's nothing sacred about quarterly earnings growth. So it's within our power, and business schools are a big part of that. That's the second part of the second chapter and the third part of the book is about reinventing business education, like we've been trying to do at the University of Vermont. That we need to creatively destroy the MBA as we know it, because the MBA as we know it is still preaching shareholder primacy and market fundamentalism. That cannot continue. We have to get to what comes next. And there's absolutely no reason why we can't do it. Right? So those larger institutional changes are going to be necessary, and business leaders need to step up to the challenge of taking that on.
Oh, wow. Okay. So yeah, I want to thank you again. I really appreciate you coming on the platform and sharing that information. I definitely look forward to the work that you have coming in the future because I know you're still working at it, and I'm sure the viewers will tap in and check out the book as well.
Appreciate
That'd
that.
be a interesting documentary too.
Indeed.